So here we go. 3, 2, 1. Everybody welcome again to From the Constituency. I'm Brian Calfano, and I'm joined today by Amy Blansett. Do you go by Amy or Amy Christine Blansett? Which one do you...
Am I in trouble or not?
Not in trouble with us, but it's good to have you on. And of course, you're well known to a lot of folks in the area because of all your great work with the Drew Lewis Foundation and with Fairbanks and everything. It's amazing how much you do. You must get about 2 hours of sleep a week. So you are out there living the mission. When people talk about making the world a better place and all that sort of stuff, it's not just talk with you, obviously. There's a lot that you do on a regular basis that some folks will never be able to do in an entire lifetime. So we just appreciate you being on here. And I wanted to get your take, Amy, on some things because I know you're not necessarily into political stuff from a partisan standpoint. You really focused a lot on the local level. But we're in a partisan environment nowadays, pretty polarized, as they say.
It seems to be that way.
And one of the things I think is interesting for folks in the Ozarks and just in Missouri in general is that there's not always been this really rightward push in politics. At least that's not how a lot of Missourians used to look at politics. It's interesting, if you go back to the 40s and 50s when a guy named Harry Truman was around, and not just around, but as President of the United States, he had a vastly different view of a lot of political issues than people who are running around today, many of whom were more than happy to quote President Truman and saying things like, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, and all this other sort of stuff. But President Truman was very much enamored with the S word. The S word. And of course, I don't necessarily mean the S word some people use on a regular basis. I mean socialism.
Yes.
Not to say that he loved the idea of socialism or he thought it was a great thing, but he was particularly peeved at people who would throw the term socialism out as some kind of roadblock to any kind of progress or any kind of collective approach to problem solving. And here's what President Truman said, a quote from a speech he gave in 1952. Let's read this and we'll put it up on the screen for folks to read along. He said, October 10th, 1952, Harry Truman, quote, "Socialism is a scare word they have hurled at every advance the people have made in the last 20 years. Socialism is what they called public power. Socialism is what they called Social Security. Socialism is what they called farm price supports. Socialism is what they called bank deposit insurance. Socialism is what they called the growth of free and independent labor unions and organizations. Socialism is their name for almost anything that helps all the people." That comes from the 33rd President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, October 10th, 1952. And I point this out because it's always fascinating to me to go back in history, because I think today there's a lot of people who don't really have an appreciation of history. And they think that what's happening now is all of a sudden new and unique in many ways. That it's never happened before in any situation. And we're sort of seeing history repeat itself, actually, with a lot of critique of folks on the left and their perspectives being critiqued by those on the right, saying, oh, it's all socialism, and somehow if it's socialistic, it's bad. Amy, I'm dumping all this in your lap so you can help make sense of it for us. I'm sure you've encountered some of this pushback in your travels because you tend to, well, so let's say mix it up with some politicians to support your causes. And I'm not trying to make this partisan. I think a lot of people want to have this devolve into a left-right Republican Democrat thing, but I think it goes beyond that. At least I hope the conversation does, because we really can't allow ourselves to get into these sort of tribal mentalities and let it just become a war between two sides.
And I agree. I mean, it's one of those where we always are making these statements when they're convenient. And so it seems to me politically that individuals will be in support of something when it comes to, we had major flooding in northwest Missouri. And when that flooding occurs, we think of the farmers and how they're not going to be able to function this year if they don't get government assistance and subsidies for their farms. Politically, we seem to have no problem supporting that. But when it comes to a group of individuals who are underrepresented or under-resourced for other reasons, they're getting rained on every single day, if you will. And we're not comfortable making sure that they have the support systems necessary to get through the week, the month, or the year so that they can build a foundation in order to move forward or move up so that they need less services. We also have this weird notion that individuals want to stay on government services, like there's some form of pride in that, and there isn't. Individuals, if you ask any of them, what they're looking for is a means for education, knowledge, how to move up the ladder. But we've put so many stops in the way that without assistance, it's not going to happen. So it seems to me that politically individuals will, like you said, use the S word when it means that we're going to be assisting an individual that doesn't fit in what their model means of someone who's deserving. And that's really where it's a slippery slope. Who gets to decide who's deserving? We also, like in our country, of the nearly $500 billion that go into social services, most of them are going into single households. And so we have a lot of politicians on the week that you spent in Jeff City with me making statements that, well, if we could just fix marriage, then we would fix the problem, this cause-effect concept. If the majority of the money goes to single people, maybe we should just make them married people, and that would solve the problem. And so we have a lot of this very quick to jump cause-effect versus, well, let's go upstream and find out, single or married, why is that individual needing these types of assistance? And very few programs are going far enough upstream in order to really start to say, we know that people move out of poverty and off of social services by increasing in employment and education. And if we don't want to touch the idea of minimum wage, then let's start talking about education. How do we make it affordable? How do we make it something that everyone truly has access to?
Right, and as a quick aside, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are a large number of folks that you service at Fairbanks and the various programs that you run. My impression from doing stories over there is that there are a good number of married couples who are part of your program, right?
Yes.
Am I wrong about that? I mean, that's just what I've
correct.
seen. These are two-parent households struggling to get by. This isn't the stereotype of, what do you call it, what is it, the welfare queen, that kind of stereotype that gets pushed out there a lot. That's not the case at all.
Not, and that's what's really scary is that you have individuals who are single, who are looking at the person at the table next to them who's married, and even with two incomes. In our community that's supposed to be affordable, they're still not making ends meet, and they're working 40, 50-hour jobs, and they're working in an industry that we need people working in. They're working in our manufacturing and positions that are providing us all the goods that we appreciate. But even with dual income, and then we go into childcare and the fact that the daycare is eating up a majority of cost. And at least in the state of Missouri, we have some of the least amount of support for early childhood education. And when you talk about what a detriment that is to our state, let alone our country, if we are not supporting early childhood education, I mean, when we talk about going upstream and you look at research and what is truly, changing lives and preventing the need for social services, it comes back to that early childhood education. Those first couple of years change the gray matter in a brain and determine whether or not someone's going to have the capacity to fully move forward and fully be, a part of our society in the way that we, expect them to be.
What's interesting, too, to me, is the whole idea of the word socialism or term socialism is taken out of its historic political context. My understanding is it used to mean government ownership of the means of production, not a collective approach to dealing with a problem where the government provides benefits or provides some kind of incentive for people to do certain things. It seems as though anything that's collective of a certain nature, as you say, because obviously if it's benefiting your group, it's fine. It's righteous and just. Right.
It's amazing how quickly we can justify it. Like,
if it's somebody else's group that you're skeptical of, it's socialism. But collective action, collective pooling of resources, like for public education and those sorts of things, I guess you can call it socialism. And I guess technically it's socialistic in the sense that the government runs the schools. But there's also a government or a social benefit that comes from that kind of investment that can only happen at the level we're talking about, the scale we're talking about, by having as much buy-in as possible. Right?
Yeah, sorry you froze again. So
no, that's okay. It wasn't the best point that I ever made anyway. But I mean, it's the kind of thing where socialism in a political definition setting tends to mean ownership of the means of production. Mm-hmm. If you have the government, even with so-called Obamacare and all the things that people don't like about it on the right and left, that's still not socialized anything because there's no government ownership of anything going on. The government's just compelling you to do something. That's not socialized medicine. It's just a government telling you it's like you got to pay taxes, you got to do certain things. It's interesting how this term to me is sort of expanded to mean anything that you're forced to do that you don't like that doesn't in some way you think or you perceive directly benefit you or your group. And if we get into that mindset, that if it's not directly benefiting me or my group, therefore it's bad and evil, we're really hosed as a country because a lot of our perspectives are pretty finite and limited. And so if everything comes down to what you think ought to be good for you and not for somebody else, I don't know how much longer we can continue to have trust in society and I think any kind of sense of empathy for people who are in a different position than we are.
And that's one of the things where, I sent you that webpage about the group of individuals, the resource generation. And
so this thing's called resource generation for people who are wondering.
Resource generation, yes.
Okay.
And it's resourcegeneration.org is their website. And so you mentioned something about losing faith. And, I've been thinking about where and how, obviously in the nonprofit world, where and how do we get individuals to care? Because they first have to care. And it's easy to care when you see like the starving child. And we use that image. I mean, when you talk about marketing, it's like if you can have the hungry child in your marketing, you know that the numbers are going to go up. Why did people care so much about a burning church? I mean, it's an old structure and $1 billion goes very quickly into Notre Dame. And so when we're looking at, why people care and losing faith on the things that maybe people are caring about, at least those who are the wealthiest, I was kind of looking around at, is it lost? Like, are we headed down this really dark path? And while I was looking for it, that's where this resource generation came about. And it's looking at individuals. They express themselves as a multiracial group right off the bat. They are individuals who are between the ages of 18 and 35 who are among the top, 10%, but really most of them are in the top 1%. And what they have found is they feel uncomfortable. They feel very uncomfortable about the unequal distribution of wealth and the lack of giving and investing in human beings. There's a sense of hoarding with the money, and they even express how watching their parents hoard money and mass amounts that they'll never be able to spend. And so we're beginning to see not only a shift in a kind of a political shift that's happening with this, but also a human being shift. So when we talk about is there hope, looking into this group and what they're saying, but more importantly, what they're feeling and what has become important to them, to where they're going into the streets and expressing this concept that unequal distribution of wealth is not good for our country. And so when you have those who are of the wealthiest realizing it's not good for the country, it's a small movement, and they just kind of are mobilizing, but it really provides a new kind of breath of hope. Again, in the nonprofit world, all we've been hearing is that in the change in tax law, the incentivizing for individuals to give
say that again.
Provide social resources.
You broke up. Say something about the change of tax law. Start from there.
Okay. So what we see with the recent change in tax laws in the nonprofit world is we're expecting less. There's no more the incentivize are not at the same level for individuals to give. So it's really important to see that those who have the means to provide, if government isn't going to do it, then we're responsible for doing it. And that's why the nonprofit world is so large. So seeing these young, wealthy individuals who are willing to say wealth inequality is going to stop in their generation by giving. And if it isn't by giving to the government, they're willing to pay more taxes, number one. And number two, they want to figure out how to invest in nonprofits that are doing quality work, that are moving upstream to really solve the most under-resourced, the most, a lot of that's in the not only low income, but also looking at multiracial issues that come along with that. So, there is hope, and there are individuals feeling the weight of what's happening and realizing that if we do nothing, it's not very economically sustainable. I mean, we really are moving into areas of crisis when we talk about nearly half of our country being under-resourced.
Yeah, and so I think for people who are now forming their straw person arguments against what's being said here, there will always be inequality. There will always be differences in what people make in terms of their income and their talents and their achievements and all of that sort of thing. This is not about equality of outcomes, all the sort of things you hear people say. This is about the trends that economists show in terms of income distribution gaps that haven't been this large since right before the Great Depression in the late 1920s. Now, it doesn't mean we're heading for a Great Depression, but it doesn't take a genius or an economist because they're not really geniuses anyway, but it doesn't take a genius or an economist to say, oh, well, this is not healthy for society. And I think we need to try to elevate the conversation, whatever side of the aisle someone's on, or whatever their political ideology. I don't think it's helpful for the country, for anybody watching this, especially in the Ozarks, to let this conversation for the 2020 election devolve into socialism versus capitalism, because that's just nonsense. There's socialism in just about everything. At least there's a social aspect, a social benefit aspect to just about everything. I'm still back on the misappropriation of the word socialism because, again, technically the definition's about the government ownership of the means of production. That's not what we're talking about in the vast majority of cases, right? So every time this word gets run out there, and we saw from former President Truman's quote that it's something that's been going on for a very long time, it's a misappropriation in just about every case. And you may not think that government spending in certain areas is wise, and that's fine. I just don't want to see a very easy, rhetoric-driven campaign on the part of the right or the left. Basically either saying socialism's the best thing ever or saying socialism is the devil incarnate. Because I don't think that helps anybody with truly getting at the issues that are really underneath a lot of the problems that we're seeing. And as you're talking about going upstream and trying to figure out, okay, so how is it people end up in the situations they're in, and how can we work further upstream to try to prevent those things? And it's not all about an individual's morality or personal decisions or personal responsibility and all that sort of thing, because obviously people of all kinds make decisions that don't always pan out. And again, because that's where a lot of that discussion goes. Well, those mothers with those kids, they decided to have those kids and all that sort of thing, and they're at fault for all of that. If they couldn't afford it, they shouldn't have had the child. All those kinds of personal judgments that people make, and you basically sort of just make this value judgment about people. But if you were in a business or you were doing something in another type of part of life where you made a decision and it didn't pan out for you economically, in some cases that's okay then to get bailed out. That's all right.
Yeah, pick and choose.
It's hypocrisy. It's hypocrisy.
Well, and again, we know that individuals who are given opportunities, it's, the Lucky Sperm Club. You may be born into opportunities, or... I
hadn't heard that one before, but I'll tell you what, that's about it. That's
a good one. I was not born into that in the idea of wealth, but I was born into that idea resources and, making sure that education was important. And so I still live just above what's considered poverty because I'm a single female. And the reason I'm not married is because my husband died. And so when I see individuals saying, well, if we could just fix the marriage problem, I want to look at them and say, so, yeah, right. I mean, I could run out and get married again, and then my household would be stable. That is not what is right for me and my children right now. And so we live just above the poverty level. I could work 2 jobs, and I do. Just one of them happens to be nonprofit, which also doesn't make money. So, it's one of those when we look at how are we labeling individuals and when is it okay to label it, it's never okay to lump everyone together. And that's what we begin to do politically. All those people or all these people. And really, again, there's some simple pathways in order to reduce all of this, to getting individuals educated. Springfield's doing a lot of really good things when we look at those who qualify for some different benefits immediately get access to education. Some of the problem is the education that they have access to then leads them into jobs that are still only $11 or $12 an hour, which honestly, my kids are making that, and that's not a livable wage. So then as a small business owner, I understand when we start talking about wage, man, that gets very scary. And who gets the right to tell me what I can pay my employees? Because that might put my company out of business. So then it's okay, what are we willing to do? We're either going to pay or we're going to pay. We're paying more in social resources because families can't make the dollar. And then we start getting into a bit of political parts of, we see those employers who are getting benefits. Basically, if I pay my people less and they qualify for the daycare assistance, then I'm still paying. I'm paying higher tax dollars. I'm paying, corporate dollars in order to make up for what it costs for that child to go to daycare. So one way or another, the same amount of money is going out of my pocket or out my door. It's what part would I rather have control over? And when I'm having to pay into the government because I'm not willing to personally invest either through my company or my giving, then someone's going to be telling me how to give. And so it's always this battle of, do we want social in the sense it's the right thing to do? Or do we want government is telling me how to do what I may not feel is right? So it's really, like I said, how do we go upstream and figure out how do we make sure that people have those portals of entry so that they don't have to be asking me and you and our government for help. And it comes back to making sure that education is affordable so that they can filter up into positions that pay better.
I always feel smarter and better having spoken to you. There's a nice educational opportunity for me and for everybody else listening. Amy, Christine Blancett, you really are an inspiration, and I appreciate your time and your thoughts on all of this. We'll talk again, because this is such an important issue.
Yeah, especially because you mentioned the social medical access, and that was what my doctorate was on, so we can really upset some people in that conversation.
Sounds great to me. We'll get right on that.
All right.
Thanks, Amy.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.